The Velthri hegemony had ruled the Orion Spur for 12,000 years, and in all that time, no species had ever challenged there. Power Admiral Kethvorin stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and watched the holographic displays. Floating around him like ghostly windows into space itself, 37 warships filled those displays, and each one was a mountain of metal and fire, capable of burning entire continents to ash. This was the combined hegemony fleet, and it was the most powerful military force assembled in 300 years. Kethvorin allowed himself a moment of pride as he looked at his armada. The Dreadnought-class vessels alone numbered 15, and each dreadnought was a city-sized fortress bristling with plasma lances and protected by shields that had been reverse-engineered from a dead precursor race. No weapon in the known galaxy could penetrate those shields, and no species had ever destroyed a dreadnought in combat. The other races of the galaxy understood this simple truth, and they paid their tribute, and they bowed, and they survived. Those who did not bow, did not survive. Below the fleet hung the Relathi homeworld, and it was a beautiful planet of blue oceans and green forests and cities that sparkled like jewelry in the sunlight. The Relathi had been a peaceful species once, and they had welcomed the hegemony's protection and paid their tribute without complaint for nearly 1,000 years. But something had changed in the last decade. The Relathi had begun to speak of freedom, and they had begun to talk to other subjugated species about forming a coalition. They called it the Relathi Rebellion, and they spoke of independence as if it were something they deserved. Admiral Kethvorin found this amusing in a sad sort of way. The Relathi had no warships and no weapons capable of threatening even the smallest hegemony patrol vessel. Their rebellion was nothing more than words and dreams, and today those dreams would die. The Hegemony Council had ordered a demonstration, and Kethvorin was happy to provide one. He would burn 3 of their largest cities, and he would broadcast the destruction across 1,000 star systems. Every species in the Orion Spur would watch, and they would remember why they paid tribute. They would remember why they bowed. His second-in-command approached with a data tablet and bowed deeply before speaking. Admiral, the fleet reports all weapons charged and ready, and the targeting solutions for the primary cities have been confirmed. Kethvorin nodded slowly and savored the moment. Excellent. And what of the Relathi Defense Forces? They have none. Admiral, and their orbital stations have been evacuated, and their leaders are broadcasting pleas for mercy on all channels. Let them plead, Kethvorin said with a cold smile. Their words mean nothing, and in 1 hour, their cities will be glass. He turned to look at the planet below and imagined the fear that must be spreading through those glittering cities. Millions of Relathi looking up at the sky and knowing that death was coming and knowing that no one would save them. This was the natural order of things, and the strong ruled and the weak served, and those who forgot their place were reminded with fire. A sensor officer's voice suddenly cut through the silence of the bridge, and there was something strange in that voice, something that sounded almost like fear. Admiral, we have an unknown contact, and a single vessel just appeared at the edge of the fleet formation. Kethvorin frowned and turned away from the viewport. Appeared? And what do you mean, appeared? It did not jump in through normal FTL, Admiral, and there was no transition signature, and one moment the space was empty, and the next moment the ship was there. This was unusual, but not alarming. Perhaps it was some Relathi freighter trying to flee the system before the bombardment began. Perhaps it was a diplomatic vessel from one of the other subjugated species come to beg for mercy on the Relathi's behalf. Show me, Kethvorin commanded. The main view screen flickered, and the image of the unknown vessel appeared. Kethvorin stared at it and felt something he had not felt in many years. He felt confused. The ship was unlike anything in the hegemony's databases, and it was unlike anything he had ever seen in his 200 years of service. It was dark and angular and brutal in its design, with no elegant curves like hegemony vessels and no crystalline Structures like Ralathi ships. It looked like it had been carved from shadow itself, and its matte black hull seemed to swallow the light of distant stars, and it was small by hegemony standards. It was barely frigate class, and it was perhaps 1/10 the size of a dreadnought. Identify that vessel, Cathvorin ordered. Sensor officer's hands moved frantically across his console, and his confusion was obvious. We cannot, Admiral, and there is no transponder signal and no energy signature that matches any known species, and the hull composition is unknown, and our scanners cannot penetrate it. Cathvorin felt a cold sensation in his stomach, but he pushed it away. In 12,000 years, the hegemony had catalogued every spacefaring species. In this region of the galaxy, there were no unknowns. There could be no unknowns. It must be some new Ralathi design, he said. Some desperate attempt at resistance. Admiral, the Ralathi have no shipbuilding capability, and they have never produced anything like this. Before Cathvorin could respond to communication, channel opened on the Bridget. Opened without permission, and it cut through their encryption. Like the encryption did not exist, a voice spoke from the speakers, and it spoke in perfect hegemony standard. The voice was calm and measured, and somehow the calmness was more unsettling than any threat could have been. This is the UNSS Pale Horse of United Nations Space Navy, and you are engaged in an illegal military action against a civilian population, and you have one opportunity to withdraw, and this is not a negotiation. Silence filled the bridge. Every officer had frozen in place, and every eye was fixed on the view screen, where the dark, angular ship hung, motionless against the stars. Cathvorin felt that cold sensation again, but this time it was stronger. United Nations Space Navy. He had never heard those words before, and no species in the known galaxy used such a name. But he was Admiral of the Combined Fleet, and he commanded the most powerful armada in 300 years, and he would not show fear in front of his officers. He laughed. The sound was loud in the silent bridge, and after a moment his officers joined him. Their laughter was nervous, but it was laughter, and it pushed back the strange fear that had settled over them. One ship, Cathvorin said, when the laughter died. One tiny ship demands that we withdraw. He shook his head and smiled at the audacity of it. Transmit to the fleet and order 12 destroyers to break formation and destroy that vessel, and make it quick, because I want to begin the planetary bombardment on schedule. The orders went out, and 12 hegemony destroyers broke from the main fleet and accelerated toward the unknown vessel. Each destroyer was crewed by 300 of the hegemony's finest warriors, and each one carried enough firepower to crack a small moon. Cathvorin watched them go and felt his confidence returning. Whatever this unknown ship was, and whoever these humans were, they would learn the same lesson that every other species had learned. They would learn that the hegemony was supreme. They would learn, or they would die. The view screen, the dark ship called Pale Horse, hung motionless and waited. The 12 destroyers of the hegemony fleet raced toward the unknown vessel, and their captains were eager for the kill. Each captain knew that destroying an unidentified ship would bring honors and promotions, and perhaps even a personal commendation. From Admiral Cathvorin himself, they pushed their engines to maximum speed, and they charged their plasma lances, and they prepared to demonstrate why the hegemony had ruled for 12,000 years. The dark ship called Pale Horse did not move. It hung motionless in space like a piece of carved obsidian, and it did not attempt to flee or evade or even raise shields. Commander Yethril of the destroyer Swift Vengeance found this strange, but he did not let it concern him. Perhaps the unknown vessel was damaged and could not maneuver. Perhaps its crew was frozen with fear at the sight of 12 hegemony warships bearing down on them. It did not matter. In a few moments, there would be nothing left but scattered atoms and debris. All ships report weapons locked, his tactical officer announced. We are at optimal firing range. All ships fire. Commander Yethral ordered 12. Destroyers opened fire simultaneously, and the blackness of space was lit by brilliant streams of blue-white. Plasma lances were the primary weapons of the hegemony, and they had been refined over millennia to devastating perfection. These weapons had melted asteroid bases and cracked planetary shields and burned through the hulls of 1,000 enemy vessels. The beams converged on the Pale Horse from all directions, and there was no possible way for any ship to survive such concentrated fire. The plasma struck the dark hull, and then something impossible happened. The beams did not impact. They did not splash against shields. They bent. The plasma streams curved around the vessel's hull like water flowing around a stone in a river, and then they dissipated into nothing. Commander Yethral stared at his view screen, and his mind refused to process what his eyes had just witnessed. What he began to say, the Pale Horse fired there was no visible projectile, and no beam of light, and no missile trail streaking through space. Sensor officers across all 12 destroyers would later describe it as a ripple. It was a distortion in the fabric of space itself, and it moved at speeds that their instruments could not measure. It moved faster than light itself. Commander Yethral saw the ripple for perhaps half a second, and in that half second, understood that everything the hegemony believed about its own supremacy was a lie. Then his ship ceased to exist. It did not explode. It did not break apart. It was simply gone where the swift vengeance had been. There was only empty space and a faint shimmer that faded almost immediately. The same thing happened to all 12 destroyers in the span of a single heartbeat. 12 ships, 8,000 crew members, gone as if they had never existed at all, on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion. Admiral Keth Voran stared at his tactical display and watched 12 vessel indicators blink out of existence simultaneously. The cold sensation in his stomach had become a block of ice. "Report," he commanded, and his voice cracked slightly. "What happened to our destroyers?" His sensor officer was trembling, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "They are gone, Admiral, and there is no debris and no energy residue and no escape pods, and they simply vanished." "That is impossible," Keth Voran said, but even as he spoke the words, he knew they were hollow. He had just watched the impossible happen. Time elapsed from engagement to destruction. He asked, 11 seconds, Admiral. 11 seconds, 12 warships and 8,000 hegemony soldiers had been erased from existence in 11 seconds, and the unknown vessel had not even moved. Cawthorn looked at the view screen where the Pale Horse still hung motionless against the stars. It was so small it was barely larger than a patrol craft, and yet it had just destroyed 12 destroyers without apparent effort. What kind of technology could do such a thing? What kind of species possessed such power? The Admiral felt fear crawling up his spine, but he forced it down. He was Keth Voran of the hegemony, and he had commanded fleets in a dozen campaigns, and he had never lost a battle. He would not lose now. All ships, he commanded, and this time his voice was steady. Full fleet engagement, and concentrate all fire on that vessel, and do it now. The remaining 35 warships of the combined fleet responded immediately. They had all witnessed the destruction of the destroyers, and they understood that they faced something beyond their experience, but they were hegemony, and they had ruled for 12,000 years, and they did not flee from a single enemy vessel. The fleet opened fire with everything they had. Plasma lances from 15 dreadnoughts struck at the Pale Horse kinetic accelerators, launched tungsten rounds at a significant fraction of light speed. Gid torpedoes with exotic matter warheads streaked toward the target from all directions. Firepower directed at the small dark ship could have cracked a small moon or burned the surface of a planet to molten glass. Pale Horse drifted through it all, untouched, unharmed. The plasma beams bent around it. The kinetic rounds vanished into that rippling distortion field. The torpedoes detonated harmlessly against something that the sensors could not even detect, and then the dark ship began to move. Keth Voran watched the tactical display and felt his understanding of reality crumble. The Pale Horse did not accelerate like a normal vessel. It did not follow the laws of physics that governed every other ship in the galaxy. It simply was in one place, and then it was in another place. It flickered through space like a ghost, and it moved in angles that should have been impossible. One moment it was at the edge of the fleet formation. The next moment it was in the center, then it was behind a heavy cruiser, and then beside a carrier, and then somewhere else entirely. And each time it paused, that terrible ripple fired one ship gone, then another, then two more. Simultaneously, Tant watched his fleet dying, and he understood that they had made a terrible mistake. They had not encountered an unknown species. They had encountered something else entirely. They had encountered gods, or perhaps they had encountered demons. The Pale Horse continued its harvest, and the tactical display filled with the ghosts of vanished ships. "Admiral," his second-in-command said, and there were tears streaming down his face. "What do we do?" Kethvorn had no answer. For the first time in his 200 years, he had no answer at all. He could only watch as the small dark ship moved through his fleet like death itself, and erased everything the hegemony had built. No one in the hegemony had ever seen a ship move the way the Pale Horse moved. It did not follow the rules of space travel that every species in the galaxy understood and accepted. It did not accelerate or decelerate, did not turn or bank or roll. It simply existed in one location, and then it existed in another location, and the distance between those locations meant nothing to it. Captain Morthvex of the dreadnought Crushing Thunder watched the dark ship appear beside his vessel, and he screamed. The order to fire every weapon on his massive warship turned toward the enemy and unleashed. Destruction plasma lances burned through space kinetic rounds, hammered toward the target. Close range defense systems that were designed to destroy incoming missiles pivoted and added their fire to the barrage. For 3 seconds, the Crushing Thunder poured everything it had at the Pale Horse from point-blank range. The dark ship hung motionless and let the weapon's fire wash over it like rain on stone. Then the ripple came. Captain Morthvex had time to see it approaching, and he had time to understand that he was about to die. Did not have time to feel afraid. The Crushing Thunder and its crew of 12,000 simply ceased to exist across the fleet formation. The same scene repeated again and again. The Pale Horse would appear beside a vessel, and the vessel would fire, and the weapons would do nothing, and then the vessel would vanish. Sometimes the dark ship destroyed one vessel at a time. Sometimes it destroyed 2 or 3 simultaneously. The hegemony crews fought with everything they had, and it made no difference at all. Admiral Kethvorn watched his tactical display and counted the dying 28. Ships remained in 21th and 14. All ships retreat, he screamed. Emergency FTL, jump and scatter pattern Alpha, and go now. The order went out to every surviving vessel, and their crews rushed to obey. FTL drives powered up, and navigation computers calculated escape vectors and captains prayed to gods they had not believed in since childhood. Nothing happened. The drives would not engage. Admiral, the engineering officer reported with horror in his voice. Something is jamming our FTL systems, but I do not understand how. And the drives believe they are already in transit, but we are not moving. Kethvorn felt despair settling over him like a heavy blanket. They could not fight. They could not run. They could only wait and watch and die on the view screen. The Pale Horse paused in the center of the remaining fleet. 14 hegemony warships surrounded it in a rough sphere, and for a moment, nothing moved. Surviving captains looked at each other through their communication links, and an unspoken agreement passed between them. If they were going to die, then they would die fighting. Every ship fired at once. 14 vessels, including 3 dreadnoughts, unleashed every weapon they possessed at maximum power. The firepower concentrated on that small dark ship could have glassed a continent. It could have cracked the planet's crust. It could have destroyed a small moon. The barrage lasted for nearly 10 seconds, and when it finally ended, the sensors struggled to penetrate the cloud of superheated plasma and debris that filled the space where the Pale Horse had been. "Did we get it?" someone asked on the command channel. The plasma cloud cleared. The Pale Horse hung motionless in the exact same position. There was not a scratch on its dark hull. There was not a single mark or burn or indication that it had been struck by anything at all. The despair that had been settling over Admiral Kethvaran became complete. He understood now that they had never had a chance. From the moment the dark ship had appeared, they had been dead. They simply had not known it yet. The Pale Horse began to move again, and the harvest resumed. 7 ships remained, and then 7 became 6, and then 5. The carrier Endless Supremacy tried to launch its fighter wings and 300 attack craft scrambled from its base. The small ships were fast and maneuverable, and their pilots were the best in the hegemony. Perhaps they could succeed where the capital ships had failed. Perhaps their numbers would overwhelm the enemy. The Pale Horse paused and seemed to consider the swarm of fighters for a moment. Then something new happened. Pulse expanded from the dark ship's hull. It was invisible to the naked eye, but it was devastating to electronics. Every fighter went dark simultaneously. Life support failed, engines died, weapons went offline. 300 pilots found themselves drifting helplessly in dead ships, and they could only watch through their canopies as the Pale Horse slid past them. The dark ship did not destroy the fighters, it simply ignored them. They were not worth the effort. The carrier Endless Supremacy was worth the effort. The ripple took it, and 12,000 more hegemony soldiers vanished from the universe. Kethvaran sat in his command chair on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion and watched the final moments of his fleet. 7 ships remained. The flagship was still alive, but it would not be alive for much longer. Around him, his officers had stopped fighting. Some were weeping openly, and some were praying, and some were simply staring at nothing with empty eyes. Sensor officers spoke in a voice that sounded dead. 187 seconds. Admiral and 40 ships destroyed, and we have 7 remaining. 187 seconds, just over 3 minutes. The most powerful fleet assembled in 300 years had been reduced to 7 ships in just over 3 minutes. And the enemy vessel did not have a single scratch. Kethvaran thought about his career and his victories and the enemies he had crushed. He thought about the tribute fleets he had commanded and the rebellions he had suppressed and the species he had forced to bow. He had believed that the hegemony was the greatest power in the galaxy. He had believed that no one could challenge them. He had been wrong. The Pale Horse drifted closer, and its dark hull seemed to swallow the light of the stars. Admiral Kethvaran waited for the ripple that would erase him from existence. But the ripple did not come. Instead, the communication channel opened again, and that same calm voice spoke. "Admiral Kethvaran, your fleet is effectively neutralized, and your remaining vessels have had their weapons and propulsion systems disabled, and your life support will continue functioning." The Admiral looked at his console and saw that it was true. Every system on his ship was dead, except for life support and communications. They were not going to die, at least not yet. But why? Why had the humans spared them? What did they want? The calm voice spoke again, and it answered his unspoken question. "We need to talk, Admiral." 7 ships remained from the mightiest fleet the hegemony had assembled in 300 years. 7 ships drifting helplessly in space, with their weapons dead and their engines cold, and their crews sitting in silence. Admiral Kethvaran slumped in his command chair and stared at the view screen where the Pale Horse hung motionless among the wreckage of his ambitions around him. His officers had stopped weeping and stopped praying now. They simply waited. They waited to learn why they were still alive. The communication channel remained open, and the calm human voice waited patiently for the Admiral to respond. Kethvaran found that his throat was dry and his hands were shaking, but he forced himself to speak. "What do you want?" There was A pause before the answer came. "That is a complicated question, Admiral, and I will do my best to answer it. But first, let me introduce myself properly, and my name is Captain Sarah Chun of the United Nations Space Navy, and I command the vessel you have been attempting to destroy for the last 3 minutes." Kethvoran noted that the human captain did not sound angry or hostile. She sounded patient. She sounded like a teacher explaining something to a slow student. "You said you are human." The Admiral said, "I have never heard of your species, and no human vessel appears in any hegemony database." "That is correct," Captain Chum replied. "Humanity has not made formal contact with the species of the Orion Spur until now, and we have been watching your region of space for some time, but we chose not to reveal ourselves." "Watching us?" "Yes, Admiral, and we have been observing the hegemony and its subject species for approximately 200 of your years. 200 years, the hegemony sensor networks were the most advanced in the known galaxy, and they had never detected any sign of these humans. They had been watching for 200 years, and no one had known why," Kethvoran asked. "Why watch us, and why reveal yourselves now?" "We were waiting," Captain Chen said. "We were waiting to see if the hegemony would change, and if it would evolve beyond the need for conquest and subjugation. And unfortunately, that has not happened." She paused, and when she spoke again, there was something harder in her voice. "Today you came here to murder millions of innocent civilians, Admiral, and you came to burn cities and slaughter families in broadcast. The destruction as a warning to other species, and we could not allow that." Kethvoran felt a flash of his old defiance. "The Ralathi are rebels, and they refuse to pay tribute, and they challenge the natural order of things." "The natural order," Captain Chun repeated, and there was something in her tone that made the Admiral's defiance wither. "Let me tell you about the natural order, Admiral, and let me tell you what we have observed in our 200 years of watching. We have seen the hegemony extract wealth from 1,000 worlds and leave those worlds impoverished and starving. And we have seen your tribute fleets strip entire civilizations of their resources and their hope and their future. We have seen species that dared to speak of freedom punished with orbital bombardment, and we have seen children die in the fires. Your ships rain down. We have watched and we have recorded everything, and we have decided that the natural order, as you call, it is not natural at all, and it is simply cruelty dressed in fine clothes." Kethvoran said nothing. There was nothing he could say. "Admiral, look at your tactical display." Captain Chung continued, "Count your dead, and 40 ships have been destroyed in 228 seconds, and over 40,000 of your soldiers are gone, and they are not dead, Admiral. And they simply no longer exist." The Admiral looked at his display and saw the empty spaces where his fleet had been. "We did not want to do this," the captain said. "We gave you a chance to withdraw, and you chose to attack instead, and so we demonstrated what we are capable of, and now you will listen." "Listen to what?" "To the terms of humanity's first contact with the Orion Spur." Kethvoran felt a chill run down his spine. "Terms. This was not a battle. This was not even a war. This was a sentencing. The Ralathi will not be harmed," Captain Chun stated. "Neither will any other species currently under hegemony control, and your tribute fleets will be disbanded effective immediately, and your subjugated worlds will be given the choice of independence or continued association with the hegemony on equal terms." "You cannot," Kethvoran protested. "The hegemony spans 1,000 systems, and you are one ship, and even if your technology is superior, you cannot enforce such demands across such a vast territory." There was a pause when Captain Chun spoke again. There was something almost gentle in her voice. "Admiral, we are not one ship." She let that statement hang in the air for a moment. "Right now, at this very moment, there are human vessels in orbit around every core world of the hegemony, and they have been there for years, and they are silent and cloaked and watching, and your sensors have never detected them, and your patrols have never seen them. Kethvorin felt the blood drain from his face. That is impossible. No, Admiral, it is simply technology that your species has not yet developed, and we have had a very long time to refine our capabilities. You have ships at every core world. Yes. How many ships? Enough. The Admiral's mind reeled. The yes. Hegemony had believed itself to be the supreme power in this region of space. They believed that no one could challenge them. But all along there had been something else out there. Something watching, something waiting. Something so far beyond them that they had never even known it existed. What are you? Kethvorin whispered. We are humanity, Captain Chun replied. We are a species from a small blue world, very far from here, and we are what happens when a people who nearly destroyed themselves a dozen times finally learns to reach for the stars. Why do you care about the Relathi? And why do you care about any of this? And what does it matter to you what the hegemony does? Because we remember. Admiral, there was something in those words. Something. Heavy and old and painful. We remember what it is like to be small, and we remember what it is like to be conquered, and we remember what it is like to look up at the sky and pray for someone to help. Captain Chun paused. No one came to help us, Admiral. And we had to save ourselves, and it took us a very long time, and we made many mistakes along the way. But we survived, and we grew, and we reached the stars, and when we looked out into the galaxy, we saw the same patterns repeating everywhere. We saw the strong crushing the weak and the powerful taking because they could, and we asked ourselves a question. What kind of species do we want to be? Kethvorin listened and found that he could not look away from the dark ship on his view screen. We chose to be the answer, Admiral, and we chose to be the help that never came for us. The communication channel fell silent for a moment. Then, Captain Chun spoke again. These terms are not negotiable, and you will return to your homeworld, and you will deliver our message to the Hegemony Council, and they will comply, or they will face the consequences. And if they refuse, another pause. Admiral, you have seen what one human vessel can do to your greatest fleet, and do you really want to discover what happens when we stop holding back? Kethvorin looked at the empty spaces on his tactical display. He looked at the 7 crippled ships that were all that remained of 47 warships. He looked at the small, dark vessel that had done all of this in less than 4 minutes. No, he said quietly, I do not. Then we understand each other and deliver our message, Admiral, and tell your council that humanity is watching, and we will continue to watch, and any species that chooses cruelty will answer to us. The pale horse began to drift away from the crippled fleet. One more thing, Admiral. Yes, the beings you call the Relathi have a name for themselves, and they call themselves the People of the Dawn, and I think you should start using that name. I understand. Good and safe travels, Admiral, and we will be watching. Admiral Kethvorin sat alone in the darkness of his crippled flagship and stared at the view screen. The pale horse still hung in space. A short distance away, and its dark angular hull was barely visible against the stars around the Admiral, his bridge. Crew worked in silence, trying to restore basic systems and compile damage reports and account for the dead. But Kethvorin was not thinking about damage reports. He was thinking about everything he had believed and everything he had been taught and everything that had just been proven wrong. For 200 years, he had served the hegemony, had commanded fleets and conquered worlds, and forced entire species to bow before the might of his civilization. He had believed that the hegemony was eternal. He had believed that nothing could threaten them. He had been a fool. The communication channel crackled, and Captain Chun's voice returned, Admiral, I sense you have more questions. Kethvorin was surprised that the human had contacted him again. He had expected the pale horse to simply leave and disappear back into whatever shadow it had come from. I do, he admitted, if you are willing to answer them. I am willing to answer some of them, and there is value in understanding, Admiral, and perhaps, if you understand, you will be better able to explain our message to your council. The Admiral gathered his thoughts. You said humanity nearly destroyed itself a dozen times, and what did you mean by that? There was a long pause before Captain Chun answered. Our species emerged on a single world, Admiral, and for most of our history, we were divided into competing nations and tribes and factions, and we fought wars against each other constantly. We developed weapons of terrible power and more. Then once we came within moments of using those weapons to end our own civilization, we committed atrocities against each other that I will not describe because they are too painful to speak of. We enslaved each other, and we conquered each other. And we built empires that crushed the weak beneath their heels. Kethvorin found this hard to believe. The technology displayed by the Pale Horse was so far beyond anything the hegemony possessed that he had assumed humanity must be an ancient and wise species. But Captain Chun was describing something very different. You were like us, he said slowly. Yes, Admiral, and in many ways we were worse, and we did terrible things to each other and to our own world. But we also produced individuals who saw beyond the cycle of violence and who dreamed of something better, and slowly over many generations, those dreams began to spread. We learned to cooperate, and we learned to see each other as fellow beings worthy of dignity and respect, and we began to build something new. It was not easy, and it took a very long time, and there were many setbacks along the way. But eventually, we reached the stars. And when we did, we brought our history with us. We brought our memories of what we had done to each other, and we brought our shame and our regret and our determination to do better. Kethvorin considered this. So when you looked out at the galaxy and saw the hegemony and the other empires, you saw your own past. Yes, Admiral, and we saw species making the same mistakes we had made, and we saw the strong crushing the weak, and we saw innocent beings suffering under the rule of those who believed that power was its own justification, and we could not simply watch and do nothing. The Admiral looked at his tactical display one more time. 240 seconds. That was how long the entire engagement had lasted from the moment the Pale Horse had first appeared to the moment it had disabled his remaining ships. 240 seconds to destroy 40 warships and kill over 40,000 soldiers and completely reshape the balance of power in the Orion Spur. Your technology, he said. How is it possible, and how are you so far ahead of us? Time, Admiral, and we have had a great deal of time, and we have not spent that time conquering other species and extracting tribute. And we have spent it learning and growing and developing. When you focus all your energy on domination, you limit yourself and you become stagnant, and you stop advancing because you do not need to advance. But when you focus on cooperation and mutual benefit, you create something that can grow without limit and every new perspective. And every new idea makes the whole stronger. The hegemony has ruled for 12,000 years, and in that time your technology has barely changed, and you are still using the same weapons and the same drives and the same shields that you used at the beginning. Humanity has been spacefaring for a fraction of that time, and look at what we have accomplished. Kethvorin felt the truth of those words settle into his bones. The hegemony had conquered every species they encountered. They had taken the best technology and the best minds and put them to work serving the Empire, but they had never truly cooperated. They had never allowed the subjugated species to contribute as equals. They had simply taken and taken and taken, and they had stagnated. What happens now? The Admiral asked. Now you return home, and you deliver our message, and your Council will have a choice to make. They can accept a new reality and begin the process of reform and transformation, and perhaps in time the hegemony can become something worthy of respect. Or they can refuse, and they can try to fight us, and they will lose. We do not want to destroy the hegemony, Admiral, and we do not want to conquer you or rule you, and we simply want you to stop hurting others. And if the Council agrees, and what will you do then? We will watch, and we will help where we can, and we will protect those who cannot protect themselves. We will be what we wished someone had been for us when we were small and alone and afraid. The pale horse began to move its dark hull, turned away from the crippled fleet, and oriented toward open space. One last thing, Admiral. Yes, Captain Chun. The being who attacked your destroyers at the beginning of our engagement, and the being who destroyed your fleet, and the being who disabled your remaining ships. That was not me. The pale horse is controlled by an artificial intelligence that we call Guardian, and Guardian has been watching over this region of space for the past century. I am simply here to deliver the message and to answer your questions. Kethvorn felt a new chill run through him. The entire battle, the impossible technology, the godlike power, it had all been controlled by a machine. And if this was what a single machine could do, what could humanity itself accomplish? Guardian wanted me to tell you something, Admiral. What? Guardian says that it has been watching the Rolothi for a very long time, and it has seen their kindness and their courage and their hope. Guardian says that when the Rolothi looked up at your fleet today, they prayed for help, and Guardian heard them. And Guardian says that it will always hear them, and it will always answer. The pale horse flickered once like a shadow in the light, and then it was gone. It did not jump away, or accelerate, or transition. Through FDLIT simply vanished, as if it had never been there at all. Admiral Kethvorn sat in the darkness of his crippled flagship, and looked at the space where the impossible ship had been. Around him his officers began to speak in hushed voices. They were alive, they had survived, but nothing would ever be the same. Admiral thought about the message he would carry home. He thought about the Council, and how they would react, and what they would decide. He thought about the hegemony, and its 12,000 years of dominance, and its absolute certainty that nothing could challenge its power. And he thought about a small dark ship that had changed everything in 240 seconds. The galaxy will remember this day, he said quietly now. One answered, but somewhere out there in the vast darkness between the stars, Kethvorn knew that something was watching, something was waiting, something was protecting the weak and the helpless, and the afraid. Humanity had arrived. Then the galaxy would never be the same. On the planet below, the Rolothi looked up at the sky and saw the hegemony fleet drifting helplessly in orbit. They did not know what had happened. They did not know about the pale horse, or the humans, or the message that would reshape their future, but they knew one thing. They knew that they were still alive, and for the first time in 1,000 years they began to hope. Somewhere far away, a ship called Guardian watched over them, and somewhere even farther away, a species called humanity. Smile. The answer had arrived 240 seconds. That was all it took to change everything. That was all it took to prove that even the strongest empire could fall. That was all it took to show the galaxy that no one was beyond help. And that was all it took to remind the universe that humanity remembers what it is like to be small. The stars burned in the darkness, and humanity watched over them all.